Hi everyone, it's Matt Ellis, your instructor for ORL 320. It's February 28th. I've done one of these videos before, and I did a PowerPoint a couple of Mondays ago that you received. And this is my next way to connect and talk a little bit about what you've been doing the past few weeks as a summary, and kind of also talk a little bit about your preparation for your midterm presentation. So let's start. We talked a little bit about week 3, the last sort of electronic communication that I had with you, and now let's talk a little bit about week 4. Week 4 was focusing on action research, and that's when we kind of cracked the whiteboard book and talked about formal and informal systems. We also talked about traditional action research, which starts with data collection and diagnosis, and then action and reevaluation. So whiteboard brings up a very traditional model for OD and focuses, of course, his book on sort of the assessment and the diagnosis piece. So think about what whiteboard has done and keep that in your mind as you think about your midterm, and also how week 7's work, which is where we try to put together pieces of what we've been doing all through the semester into the beginning of some actions where you actually assess and diagnose your organization. Okay? But more about that later. So for week 4, you looked at pages 5 and 11 and 13. Some of you did 9 because there was a little bit of a mix-up in terms of the Unit 4 template. But ultimately, you got a chance to do a little bit of action research and got to look at the 6-box model, which is terrific because remember, in those 6 boxes, that's where the funny stuff happens that whiteboard talks about. So if your assessment of your organization, whatever you choose that to be, is on these 6 boxes, that's a lot of stuff to ask questions about and try to have an appreciative inquiry or a traditional sort of search about what's going well in the organization, what's not, what are those gaps, and then maybe a diagnosis to best confirm and articulate what those gaps are. Because when we understand where the gaps are, only then can we intervene. Okay? So we're assessing and diagnosing an institution, and we're using those competencies, those values that we have, that we talked about in week 3, all throughout how we interact with people. So again, 6-box model was important. And the idea of boundaries, where whiteboard says, at a certain point, you have to just pick a place to start. And there isn't really a scientific explanation for why, except he says you have to start somewhere. Is it the whole organization and you take it at a very high level, or is it the department that you work in or another department that you could go and explore? So think about the boundaries. Where will you focus your assessment in order to diagnose it? Okay? So that was the crux of week 4, and you did a terrific job. Hi again. Now let's talk a little bit about week 5. Week 5 is where we introduced systems thinking, and we looked in some of the practicing OD text for systemic and non-systemic behaviors, and it's easy to see why some things happen and some things don't in an organization. Sometimes they're cultural, based on our leaders' personalities and our leaders' values. Sometimes there are systemic behaviors based on processes, technology. Sometimes there are systemic behaviors because of customer needs or other pressures that push an organization to function on a systemic basis. The flip side, of course, is that some of those systemic behaviors can be positive or negative. But for the most part, the book talked about the systemic behaviors being positive things, things that would flow through the organization. The non-systemic behaviors were things that were isolated and had a tendency to have a turf or a territorial aspect to them. So although I did mention that some of the systemic behaviors could be based on personality, that's sort of the downside of systemic behaviors. The downside of non-systemic behaviors is also that the personality drives why it's non-systemic, that our little kingdom runs this way because it's led and has values that are separate from the organization. That's a non-systemic behavior. The technology that is specific to, or a process that's specific to a certain part of the organization, can lead to non-systemic behaviors because it's so unique, so custom to that department, that unit, that it can have negative consequences in terms of the system running smoothly. So you looked at systemic, and non-systemic behaviors. Looking at my unit document, of course we introduced complex adaptive systems. And Margaret Wheatley and other folks talk about complex adaptive systems as being really a way for the OD practitioner to view the institution. A traditional OD model really has a practitioner going in and looking for problems and trying to solve them. A complex adaptive systemic view, CAS view, means you don't bring judgments, you don't bring preconceived notions to that organization. You act as a learner, and in that learner, you act as a learner, and then in that environment, you simply be with it. You learn by being in it. You are sensitive to the differences that are happening in that environment. You are able to articulate what those differences are and point them out in transforming exchanges with your customers in that organization, and encouraging transforming exchanges between stakeholders in the organization. There's nonlinear causality, there's sensitivity dependence, there's structural patterns, there's fractals, things like that. Go back and look at that, because those are ways that you can look at whatever piece or the entire organization that you'll present in your midterm, and look at those areas and see what questions or what exploration might you have as you learn about the organization. They're just good places to dig for gaps and for differences, okay? So the final thing that we talked about were patterns in week 5, and that's really critical. The things that you see happening over and over again, whether it's a process or department behavior or individual behavior, what are those patterns? Are they good, bad, indifferent? And what does that tell you about the organizational health of that unit? Okay? So that's what we worked on in week 5. Again, separating the differences between traditional OD and this CAS sort of change agent approach. We looked at the container and differences in transformative exchange model, just kind of summarizing some things, and looked at patterns. So it was another way to look at systemic behavior, and it's a place where you can focus in your exploration.